Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm with friend of the show, Conor Harney, author of Conor's newsletter over on Substack, although it's been kind of dormant for a few years. We will probably reference a few writings there. Also, regular-ish author for Cosmonaut magazine, although again, I think your big article there was actually about 4 years ago. So, so you are a Marxist writer and thinker, and you have asked yourself, I think, an interesting question, which was, how did we get to neoliberalism as the vision of what TINA is, TINA? For those of you, there is no other answer. And why, even now that neoliberalism seems to be exhausting itself in a very real, I think that neoliberalism actually exhausted itself since like 2007, but we're kind of in this weird interim where everyone's policy instincts still remain kind of neoliberal, but the basic apparatuses of how the whole thing works is fraying at the edges and doesn't really hold together. And we see this, to me, in everything from quantitative easing to onshoring and fringe shoring and stuff like that, which just tells you that this way of building public-private partnerships, also in collusion, for lack of a better word, with international and transnational capital, is becoming harder and harder to maintain for a variety of reasons. But that's not your question. I just want to point that out because I think your answer to how we got to neoliberalism will help us understand what is happening right now as it mutates to whatever the fuck it's mutating to. And so that requires us to look at, according to you, two key things: the 1970s and the American Southeastern United States before the 1970s. And so I want to now hand this over to you and ask you, how did you get to this question? Like, why did the question of the ghost of Tina become such an animating factor in your thinking?
I think probably a lot of my generation coming up on the left, I was sort of radicalized first by the experience of the anti-war years, and then the experience of the financial crisis, Occupy. And so I started picking up on these like disparate threads of what was in the air. And it was sort of inescapable that you had this question, like neoliberalism became sort of the catchword of the day. And so there was this idea that, the sort of David Harvey answer of the workers were defeated over the course of the 1970s, and the unions were suppressed, and like all well and good. That there's truth to that story, right? Like there was, this onslaught against unions in the 1970s as they existed. But where I started to see the complexity of the situation, I found that answer was too simplistic because it didn't show the reason why, I guess, or I guess it didn't really go into the reason why unions were in a weakened position in the first place in order to be so, obliterated over the course of the next 50 years. And, a big part of it, I had this understanding growing up in the South is that, unions had never made their way south. And so, I started looking into this question of, why there was never why unions never penetrated in the way that they had in the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West. And so, the classic question of, why not organize the South? And I started to see that those answers were, one, that in the 30s, right, where this is where people start to draw the line of the sort of defeat of Southern labor, all the way. So the 30s, for your listeners, I'm sure know, it's sort of the sort of high point of American unionism or of militant unionism. And in the South, you actually had quite a militant labor movement. However, where you get into the issues of why the South was so difficult to unionize is the sectors that were, because of sort of the lagging industrialization of the South, the industries that existed to unionize were very labor intensive and not very profitable. So, think textiles, things like that. And so it was easier to break strikes. And then you had the racial division of the South and the segregation of labor. So all these things made it so that there was just difficulties. And then you had the willingness of the state to still continue to put violence against the unions in the way. For example, there's really good documentary on, I forget the 34 textile strikes that happened. And a lot of those interviews, you start to understand that there's this legacy that defeat that goes, it's intergenerational. You talk to people, you listen to these interviews of families of people who participated, and they're still afraid to talk about it in some senses. So, you have this break there. And then from there, everybody likes to cite Operation Dixie, the sort of the move to unionize the South in the late 30s as sort of the tipping point. But I do think that my colleague Travis Bird at UNCG, when I was there, he would say that 34 was really that tipping point, because the way that Operation Dixie was put into place was they didn't let organic organizers take on the job. They sent down organizers from the North that had their experience in the culture of the North and were not really willing to, or did not understand the terrain of the South. So it was sort of a lost endeavor as from the beginning. So from there, there was never really a large scale effort to organize the South to that scale from the 30s forward. Not to say that there weren't efforts, and we can go into that when we start talking about the 70s more. But just this idea that there's the memory of repression that happens, and then just the actual conditions on the ground, right? So the kind of industries that existed in the South made it more difficult to organize in the way that the larger scale industry of the North. So I think, I'm going to kick it off to you to see if you have any.
I have a lot to say. I mean, to me, this means that the failure of Reconstruction is a double failure. One, it fails to integrate the working peoples of the South into one coherent whole. You keep them racialized and apart. That one's obvious. Most leftists know it. The other, however, not as obvious one is that the South, once Reconstruction is abandoned, is basically turned into, not just for Black workers, but for the entire Southeast, a internal periphery, maybe even an internal subcolony that they actively, by policy, did not want to develop an industrial base. And if it was allowed to develop any industrial base, it was in shit like textiles, which, if anyone knows how industry tends to go, well, textiles is the first industrial industry, so it's the shittiest. Wherever you find textile workers today, you're going to find the worst conditions. And so that means you have a dual failure. And that dual failure is kind of interesting. And so it does present a problem that you see. And one of the things that you actually illustrate that's interesting, I mean, we talked about the David Harvey narrative. I am of the Philip Moralski school that David Harvey doesn't know what the fuck neoliberalism even is. Like, and I know that's an unpopular statement since he wrote the most popular book on the topic, but that he views it as a political theory to re-privatize markets. I mean, the public sector into markets. And that's not really what neoliberalism did. It created new markets where the public had public-private partnerships, but that those public-private partnerships were never fully, like, even in a welfare state notion, integrated into a state-level welfare state. So it wasn't like removing the state from like welfare. It was removing the worker's seat at the table on the public-private partnerships that had already been established in the 1950s. And I think that's a subtle distinction, but it's a very important one when you ask yourself why the 1970s go the way they do, right? And for me, there's like two questions there. There's the political voluntarist vision of David Harvey that all this was basically engineered as a way to reclaim power from the workers. And then there's the kind of economistic view of people like Andrew Kleinman or even Ernst Mandel at the time that this was actually about profitability rates and it was inevitable. I actually tend to think, in a way, neither one of those narratives sufficiently answers the question. The profitability rate does explain a lot of what began to happen in the 1970s, but not what they pulled on. Like, it wasn't like they invented financialization out of nothing, or that these public-private partnerships had not existed priorly, right? And your research goes pretty good at finding this a lot earlier than people would think. I mean, even earlier than Fordism in some ways in the Southeast. Do you want to go in a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, so that's one of the things, like the interesting threads, as I've started to go into more Southern history, just for context, I did my master's in Latin American history. And when I went to my PhD program, just for reasons of, one, wanting to understand more where I actually live, and then two, just restrictions of a PhD student with a family, I decided to start looking more into the history of the South. And as I went further back, I realized that there's this interesting, the way that state development happens in the South is primarily along the lines of these public-private partnerships. It's the only state spending really that happens is through basically by partnering and giving contracts to private companies, and that's just what happens in the course of the South. Honestly, from Reconstruction forward, and there's this weird like way that they talk about it with these public-private partnerships, and it's a way of like skirting around the issues. So like I remember reading interviews with one of the big backers of RTP, which is my big project, which is, for anybody who doesn't know, it's the Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, which was started in the 50s. So one, we're already challenging this idea of neoliberalism just at that point, going back to the 50s. But the way that he talks about state development is he's like, well, we're not actually, giving these companies any money. What we're doing is we're providing them land and resources. So, they're basically, what they're doing is they bought up all this land in the Triangle for a song, lease it for nothing. And then, of course, in the case of the Triangle, so the reason they call it that is that you have the cities of Raleigh, Chapel Hill, and Durham within a close proximity. And there's three, very important universities there that are providing graduates that are going to go into these or work for these companies coming down there. So not only are you giving them land, you're giving them a workforce as well. what you're not doing is straight away giving them anything. Like there's no formal straight direct subsidy, right? It's not a cash payment to the company. So that's interesting, the way that they would talk about it. But it's also easier to manage those racial divisions, as we talked about earlier. So building up a formal welfare state, or a in closer alignment with some of what happens, like let's say up north, where you do have better public programs for education and things like that earlier than you do in the South, because you have to maintain by law this legally segregated system. So again, it keeps the South backwards, one, because that's what's the draw. That's what's bringing people southward, is this backwardsness. They have a workforce that they can pay less than their northern workers. They can also get the inputs to the industry up north at lower cost. So basically what they are developing is the roads. They're developing basically all for mode of transport. And then as things, it's required more and more, you get electrification, things like that. But again, no state development directly in the sense of a formalized welfare state. And this is where I think we can kind of talk about the importance of talking about what I guess the terminology is typically thrown around as like the paternalistic capitalists, or the capitalist welfare, or paternalistic corporate welfare system, right? Like, so where companies, rather than rely on the state to provide goods and necessities, it's provided by the company. So there's a sense like where you got the idea of the company town, but that sort of always puts it in a negative light. There is a sense like when you start talking about getting more into the 20th century, where there is good being provided to the worker in less of that negative sense. It's one of the threads that I pick up in my work is looking at like a company like IBM, where they have this massive internal corporate welfare system where, one, you've got like great wages, you've got great benefits, but then there's all these other like cultural things that they have. Like they have the IBM Country Club for the workers, right? Like they've got these these gyms, they've got all these things that they provide to their workers in order to keep them happier.
Yeah, the Silicon Valley model doesn't actually originate in Silicon Valley. It originates in a lot of these research facilities in the Southeast, where they're also trying to keep these goods segregated. I mean, that's part of the underlying logic that people don't really see. I'm fascinated by this because there's multiple threads of political economy that you're connecting that don't normally get connected. So a lot of people miss, for example, that the South is deliberately underdeveloped as a part of U.S. industrial policy, like on purpose. And your work ties into that. A lot of people understand the failures of Reconstruction. They know the W.E.B. Du Bois. They know, but they only see this in racialized terms a lot of the time, even though Du Bois himself doesn't. And because of that, they miss that, there is, for example, I think that the stat that's pretty shocking is like in the 1930s, even non-unionized African Americans in the North actually have a higher, on average, purchasing capacity and wage than white workers in the South, and like they're like scales above what's going on in the Black community, which is part of why there is the first, Great Migration and the second Great Migration. It isn't just running from, the racist South. It's also like, well, they're running into different kinds of racist and different, but they're also going to where there's fucking work, like, and there's jobs, and that's not happening. But in so much where there are jobs, you do see the beginnings of this model that we might call like, corporate paternalism, that is going to be the basis of the Fordist model on labor, the neoliberal model. Like, this is being worked out in the Southeast, and even things like the Silicon Valley thing that we see today, you're pretty good at documenting, well, this actually already happened in the Southeast to keep these goods located within a certain sphere of the economy and not let them bleed out because of formal segregation, which is deeply legal. So there's all kinds of political economic threads, and I know work that talks about each one of these things by themselves, but because they're kind of overdetermined in a very like multi-causal sense, I haven't seen anyone try to like put them all together to explain the relationship of the South to neoliberalism. I've heard people assert, you're not the first person to assert that like neoliberalism you really see in the Dixiecrats first, like but as to how early it begins, you're one of the only people I know who's tracing it all the way back to the end of Reconstruction. So I think that's interesting. I mean, there's also these other elements of it that I want to ask you about, because the kind of shadow of this in the Southern economy is that the Southern economy is disproportionately, even to this day, dependent on the military, that it is very tied into military production. Like, in some ways, the lack of a even, say, state level Fordist infrastructure like you see in New England and New York, are in a failing sense in the industrial Midwest. You don't ever see that in the Southeast, because in some ways the military seems to be used as a bulwark off of the negative consequences of this development. So I was going to ask you, what did you see about that when you were studying?
Yeah, so the question of the military in the South, yeah, as you said, does cast a massive shadow. I live about an hour from Fayetteville.
Oh yeah, you're near, yeah.
Yeah. So
I grew up an hour from Warner Robins, so like, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. Like,
yeah. So it's so funny because it's a historical consequence of Reconstruction. The reason why there's so many military bases in the South, but they provide this again. I think what we're really trying to get at here is that we never get in the United States in general a formalized national level welfare state. So you have all these sort of competing welfare states within, and one of them happens to be the military. So actually, some of the largest scale industry in the South that does end up happening is for military purposes. So it's like you're building tanks and bombs, like that's what ends up being. And then when we start talking about like going back to RTP, a lot of the research that gets done is directly connected to the military purposes. Like my dad works in semiconductors, and I can tell you like a big part of their work goes into the military. So I mean, it is it's the reality of the South. Like, it's really hard to remove that connection.
Well, in some ways it's interesting because I think people pick up on the poverty draft, and the poverty draft, they think of the South, even though if they don't say it.
Yeah.
Which was a very real phenomenon. It's one of those things when people are pushing back against it now, it's because they're pushing back against it like transhistorically. Because like, yes, now there really isn't much of a poverty draft. There's kind of one, but not really. Whereas even before 9/11, like there's a massive like poverty draft. But there's another element of this too, and for my listeners who don't know what I mean by power draft, the high encouragement of the only way out in some of these areas, particularly if you're of color, but even if you're like relatively unskilled white, is to go into the military as a way of getting access to education, benefits, etc.
Yeah.
And also having a functional welfare state. And it kind of is a bulwark against things going totally tits up in the racialized South. I mean, particularly after World War II and the military somewhat integrated, it stands off as an offset of like, I mean, it probably is why there wasn't more riots in Black communities in the 50s and 60s, to be quite frank. So there's that, but there's also this other part of it that I think your research gets to. There's also kind of like a, for lack of a better term, a military petite bourgeois and professional program coming out of this too, that's often not looked at too, that services this military and is tied into this corporate paternalism. And like, you know, why is IBM in the South? Like it's not because they're going there for highly educated workers, even in the research triangle. They're going there to get around, you know, cost associated with what we're operating in New England, and also because they want to be near military bases because that's who they're working for. Like,
Yeah.
So yeah.
No, that's a good segue there. It's funny. So when RTP is started as this idea of, you know, basically around the boostering of the North Carolina, you know, if for anyone unfamiliar with the term boosterism, you know, basically just selling your state to bring companies there. And so it's basically this massive project to bring jobs southward. So there was a realization all the way back in the early 50s that the reliance on these very labor intensive commodities in the long run wasn't going to work, because there was already then the knowledge that they're going to move to Mexico first, you know, and then after that they move other places as well. But there's this realization that it's not going to last forever. Mm-hmm. So what they come up with is an idea to bring an influx of companies southward, and then with the idea being, if you bring the research arm of a company, then you're also going to be able to plow those advancements back into already existing industries, and then also you're going to attract, or you're going to have a basis for further development. So, but that being said, the idea around the research triangle was specifically to bring in these higher or more educated, highly skilled engineers, chemists to the South. So they didn't want in the park there to be any manufacturing. So that was one requirement. You know, you could not have a manufacturing plant on the RTP campus. Mm-hmm. Well, fast forward to the 1960s, and the project hasn't really taken hold yet. Well, IBM says, hey, we'll come down here, but you got to let us have some light manufacturing down. And they immediately concede to that. And so you can see from the very beginning that like there's the contradiction in what they want to do and what they can actually do and require of these companies. So from there, in some ways,
they have to make concessions to there being some sort of industrial proletariat. That right. This idea of the South as this like basically agrarian / research aristocracy, and I do think like there is a real direct relationship between this corporate paternalism and planter class / agrarian ideology. Like it's beyond the scope of either one of our research. It's just it's just like noticing how this rhymes with things that a lot of these groups already believe is kind of a fascinating problem. Like noticing like this idea of like subordinate labor, like if you go all the way back to like Fitzhugh, for example, this idea of subordinate labor being a more genteel, more natural way that's kind of a step between feudal and bourgeois relations as standing against bourgeois relations seems to actually be part of the like ideological genealogy that's joining up under these material conditions, creating this corporate personhood thing. And yet they have to make concessions to construction and whatnot to be able to function. Like they can't, they can't totally operate under those presumptions, even though it would probably make their ideological project easier. Is that kind of the right way to view this?
Yeah, no, I would say so. And yeah, and it's funny because over time, with these sort of this North Carolina becomes one of the most industrialized states in the Union.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that does not mean that when you say most industrialized, typically people are thinking, large scale manufacturer of, automobiles, things like that. But what actually the biggest business in North Carolina, or one of the biggest business, is food processing, agribusiness. Like, a friend of mine works for the jobs program in North Carolina in Roanoke Rapids. And one of the biggest employers in Roanoke Rapids is the poultry business. If you know anything about that, yes, it is heavily industrialized, but it's also still heavily labor intensive. And the conditions in those factories are
bad.
Nightmarish is honestly, I would say basically he's dealing with a cycle of people where they'll get laid off for a month, but because they're so because for coming to work late for 15 minutes late, or missing a single shift or something like that, but they're so desperate for people that they'll just hire that person back, but after a month of no salary, right? Or no wages, excuse me. So
yeah, I mean, and also it's one of the only industrial areas where you can have a straight up like pretty massive criminal record and like it not hurt your employment prospects, because no one wants to fucking work in a chicken factory. Like,
no,
having seen it, it's a good way to lose a finger. Like it's the work conditions are really bad. Yeah, and I think the nature of the industry, I mean, like the South getting like what we think of as modern industrial factories and stuff, like that's like in the 70s and 80s. And even then it's weird stuff. It's tobacco manufacturing. It's there is specialized stuff for the military. And then later on, you have like Japanese and Korean car manufacturers, and then even American car manufacturers moving down there because it gets out of the UAW's reach. But one of the things about that, I mean, and this is interesting, and it's one of the reasons why industrializing the South is so hard. Although we're gonna have to talk at the end of this show, we're gonna actually have to talk about how this has kicked up in like the last 2 weeks. Like, there's been legislative movements out of the South that we haven't seen in a while, like basically making collective bargaining illegal, not just for the private sector, but also, I mean, for the public sector, where in most southern states it already is. But also like making it damn near impossible to get for the private sector. And interestingly, it doesn't look like Biden's NCLRB is really going to do much about it. So we'll come back to that though. That's a pin in the future.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
So like looking at this history here, we can see that like a lot of things that are happening For example, another thing implicit in your research, I didn't see it in what I've read of yours, but is that the mass incarceration regime that hit the Black community in the Northeast and the West was already basically based off, like, this is like the rational core of the new Jim Crow thesis, which is to some degree overstated, but there is a sense in which curtailing the surplus population, which was very heavily racialized, but not just racialized, and this is what I don't like about the liberal version of this narrative, was practiced in the South first in conjunction with these things that you're talking about in this corporate paternalism, right? So, the reason why neoliberalism and mass incarceration go hand in hand is in some ways worked out probably by the 1950s in the Southeast. I mean, do you agree with that? Like,
I mean, absolutely. I mean, I would say really like it's really probably more like the 30s. I would say, but
yeah.
But yeah, so needless to say, a very long time. No, but and I do agree with you. There's this, and we in the field of Southern history, they call it the sort of Southern exceptionalism, right? Where you put all of the sins of America on of the racialization of the American population on the American South. And I remember the first, that was, obviously, I know, Derek, you grew up in the South as well. I mean, like, racism is as real as, it's something it's just a fact of life here in the South. But it's also, I don't think it's quite the same way that you get in pictures of the South from people who haven't grown up here. And I think one of the things that really like drove that home for me, I was probably in my early 20s when I came across, I was reading, funny enough, like not the popular Zinn book, but I was reading Howard Zinn's The Southern Mystique, if you've ever read it. But basically his argument is that the South is used as a bulwark so that the rest of the United States does not have to reckon with its own racial tensions.
Yes.
I
mean, getting people to understand that sundown towns were not just a Southern thing is actually kind of a fun in the darkest possible sense thing to do. Or that, like, it's interesting. I actually do think we owe Martin Scorsese a favor for talking about the racial rioting and the use of immigrants against black folks in New York, because until it showed up in that Gangs of New York movie, which is otherwise not a particularly great movie, a whole lot of people had no idea that shit happened. Like, it was just sort of, as a Southerner, I've always been sort of torn because the way that the South wants to tell the Civil War is a lie. It's about slavery. It's 100% about slavery. States' rights is about their rights to not just keep slaves. They could get that. It was about expanding the enslavement franchise. That's what it was. Yeah. For the Northeast, however, not so much about slavery. For Lincoln it was, and I think for parts of the Republicans it was. That's why Marx was supporting them. For those of you who don't know, Marx supported the Republican Party of the United States. That's one of the greatest funny historical ironies about where things are now that I like to amuse myself with. But for like industrial policymakers in the Northeast, the racial problem was still a real problem, and there was a even though they opposed slavery, they didn't necessarily know what to do with all these workers, right? Like potential workers. And they were already having the problem of lumpen development with immigrants. So it was on their mind. It's interesting for me because in some ways the New York example actually is better utilized in the South later, because it lets people know not only can you play off the dominant population, against black people, but you can also play off different minority groups against each other and also expand and contract whiteness as needed to, like, that really happens in the South. So for my favorite example of it is like Latin people, when I was growing up, unless they were very, 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 very dark, were generally considered white, and there was not that much racism aimed their way until the late 1990s, where it seemed like because of the expansion of canning factories and migrant labor in the Southeast, they were used as a scapegoat for the view of deindustrialization in the South, kind of falsely.
Yeah.
Which was able to get those narratives of anti-Latin sentiment that was common in the West to link up with Southern racism, and thus you started seeing like the bullshit you see in Florida. But that's actually a really late development, and a lot of people don't realize that, because the Southern racial notion, unlike the New England racial notion, was kind of binary. Like it was just like you're white or you're not. Like, whereas that was never true in the industrial Northeast, where yes, there's a notion of whiteness, yet it's a little bit too simple to say the Irish weren't white, et cetera, but they weren't considered full white people. I think that's an interesting thing to look at when we look at how this like why this corporate paternalism would have been so attractive to the Southeast. I think you're right that the segregation is part of it, but ironically, like it's in the North where we see the first instantiations of this, when people like don't want to support the slavery regime and they want to expand, Northeastern industrial hold over the nation, but they also don't really want to deal with like incorporating massive amounts of black agrarian workers who are undereducated and underfed. Like, this is a big social problem for them.
Yeah, I mean that's an excellent point, because they on the one hand they might oppose slavery from the standpoint of from moral principle, but again from a practical point, you mentioned the lumpenization of some of the immigrant population that comes to the United States. An interesting piece of information that I came to understand is so before it gets perfected in the U.S. South, the sort of basis of carceral of the carceral system in the U.S. is actually comes out of the New England area, where you've got all of these Irish immigrants, German immigrants coming into the United States, which makes sense, because like when you look at it because everybody, there's this very simplistic notion that you get coming out of like something like a documentary like 13 or whatever about the 13th Amendment and sort of the continuation of slavery by other means, and then like you said about the problematic nature of the new Jim Crow narrative, because it does ignore some of these elements here, because the why it starts in New England is because you have a population of a free workforce that doesn't have access to work.
Right.
That's one of the problems of free labor, right? Slavery, well, they're constrained anyway. Their movements are already accounted for, right? I mean, obviously, there's examples of resistance to slavery and societies that grow out outside of the dominant Southern society. But by and large, when we're talking about an enslaved population, we're talking about people whose, again, their movements are accounted for. Whereas in the North, yeah, go ahead. There.
No, you're right, in the Northeast, but that's also why sharecropping for both black and white laborers, and I think people ignore that like 3/4 of sharecroppers were white. Disproportionately, they were black, just like this, but in absolute numbers, there were tons of white people in them. But sharecropping is a way to do that, because it's a rentier relation, since it is a percentage rentier relation, there's very little incentive to get out of it. And by that, I mean, like, if you have to pay rent in absolute terms, the fluctuations of weather can fuck you as a farmer. Where if you have to deal with sharecropping, the fluctuations of weather can fuck you as a farmer, but you will maintain some of your produce as setback because you owe a share. You don't actually owe an absolute amount of either currency or product. Now, in the short term, that's to your benefit. In the long term, it makes it impossible to get out of the situation because your share is always relative to what you're bringing in. So you're going to have to run faster and faster and faster, and there's only so much you can do before you exhaust the soil, right? So like that is a way to maintain a semi-feudal relation in the Southeast. And one of the interesting things about this, the way the Southeast thinks of itself, and you're a Southerner and I'm a Southerner, is they really do posit themselves as like these, like, I don't know, a vanguard of the rear guard. Like we are the maintainers of pre-bourgeois relations is actually kind of their narrative to themselves. I realize that's complicated for Marxists. I've had the biggest debates in my life about whether or not like the Southern economy was properly speaking capitalist, and I'm like, well, it's capitalism with semi-feudal elements, and people get mad at me for that, and they talk about real subsumption and other stuff Marx wrote on the back of the napkin. But in a real sense, it's kind of beyond the point because as we're illustrating today, not just in terms of primitive accumulation, which Southern slavery clearly is a major contributor to the development of capital because of the primitive accumulation in all the periphery slave holding settler colonies, not just in the United States, even like you look at the Caribbean and Brazil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in a real sense, you have this like kind of fish out of water thing in the South where the Southeastern development is crucial almost as a state of exception so that you can develop all these massive accumulations of surplus in ways that aren't even efficient, but limit the problems of massive populations moving around and the free labor problem, and also totally expropriate massive amounts of capital from everybody. I mean, the plantation system is very similar to a feudal landholding. It is like, and that model in the South is maintained with sharecropping, and it's also maintained with mineral extraction. Like this is where these company towns come from. Like this idea that the company provides everything but ties everything into a closed system. I remember when the mine workers in the Southeast were talking, and this was in the 19th century, but they were talking about their relationship to the owners, and I'm like, look, we have a bourgeois system that isn't even bourgeoisified. We have not like the mine workers with like, we're not even proletarians yet. Like we're basically serfs. So this dynamic is interesting because, to jump to your more recent research, looking at the development of IBM, what it indicates is there's a willingness to experiment with what we might call the regressive reincorporation of prior forms of rentier relations or of state patronage or whatever into the market to maintain these kind of backward systems, but at the benefit of both U.S. and global capital, right? Like,
right.
Is that a fair summation of what you're trying to argue in the longue durée?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You've got to maintain, and I think, like, thinking about it, I think you used the core periphery language, and I think that is actually really apt for understanding the relationship between the South and the rest of the United States. But I think really importantly, there's cores and peripheries within.
Yeah.
So you think about, like, in terms of like the development of like my state, North Carolina, right? Like, so the triangle is very much the core. Charlotte and the triangle are the cores of North Carolina, where everything else is pretty much the periphery of
absolutely
of where and so
we Georgia, Savannah, Columbus, Atlanta, and then everything else is pretty much a wasteland. Like it's It's really, I mean, in the Southeast, it's really more obvious and extreme than in the Northeast or the West for a variety of reasons. Like the West has never been really into, but we can get into that. The West is like only kind of industrialized, like even today, because of population. Until you hit the coast, the population is low, and like, but when you look. And if you look at like the industrial economy of the West, it's extraction and it's finishing. It's not like industrial commodity production. It never really has been. Like there's not a strong history of that here. Whereas in the South, there's a commodity production, but you're right. It's like the shittiest commodities. It's food, it's textiles, it's like, and there's a way also in which if you're not in either a cultural service core like the Research Triangle or Atlanta, you're not in a port like Savannah or South Carolina, Charleston, yeah, and you're not tied to a military base like Columbus or Augusta, or your military base gets shrunk, like in where I'm from, the central of Georgia. You'll just see that place become like a basket case economy locally overnight. I mean, like it's crazy how fast those cities go, like basically nose up in the water as soon as you start shrinking the military investment, because there's so much downstream stuff and all these benefits go away, et cetera, et cetera. So people either leave, and it's also tied into white flight because, you know, a lot of people of color are not in the position. They don't have the family wealth to liquidate, to leave. So they can't leave. And so these cities get both white flight, both from racism, but also actually from social economic conditions where white people have a little bit more generational wealth, even poor white people, than black people. So they can kind of like sell their house and make a little bit of money and move to, you know, a shitty southern suburb of Atlanta or whatever, and get closer to the core of the industrial development. And I do think these dynamics go on in the rest of the country, but in the South, they're really, really, really obvious. Like it's not hidden at all. Like, you know, the way it kind of is, like, I guess maybe not in New York, because it's pretty clear the NYC is a core to everything else. But like, if you look at New England, for example, it is not as obvious, at least not until the 1970s, that this is actually happening.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think like in New England, like, it's not so obvious that, you know, this is happening around, you know, or Boston is really like this flourishing center that's bringing, attracting all these folks. But again, as you start to see things develop over time, you know, the suburbs of Boston become a hub for technology, and you know, that's just a tangent. But
well, a lot of the U.S. after the 70s, a lot of the U.S. starts to look a lot more like the Southeast, like in that.
It does, yeah.
In that sense, like a lot of liberals who talk about, oh, the Southerners ultimately won the Civil War, and they think it's because of political dominance, which is bullshit. It's more like the social technologies developed in the South are, during the beginnings of neoliberalism and under Reagan, employed everywhere. Like you just start seeing that developmental pattern throughout the United States. Like,
yeah.
Anyway, so let's talk about the 1970s. Why is the 1970s so important, Connor?
So I mean, the 1970s. That's just it's when the wheels come off everything. Like, I mean, what existed of the Fordist social compact just gets shredded. I mean, and I'm not going to get too much into that story because I think like that's been told many times before. But where
people know that, yeah.
But where I think it gets important is like, so you have this narrative of somebody like Jeff Cowie's book, you know, Staying Alive: The Last Days of the American Working Class, where you've got what actually happens though is it's not the last days of the working class. In fact, you know, where Cowie is drawing on union density, if you actually look at the numbers for the number of union drives that happen in the 70s, there's actually a very noticeable uptick. Problem is they failed. And the problem is they failed in the South. And the reason being, at that point, the way that the bargaining structure and the unionization structure was set up was so in favor of the company that even if a union won their election, there was a good chance that either the plant was going to close or the union was going to get broken up before they even got to bargain for a contract. Like, that was the reality. And so again, like, you're at this point where in the 70s, the story that we all know of unions having this onslaught against them in where they had previously been a stronghold. You also have this story that is less often told of people trying to unionize and failing miserably in the South for legal reasons, and how and that was very much part of the whole basis and the issue of the Forest Social Compact in the first place, because it really was based along these politics of resignation, right? It was this after Taft-Hartley and the basically the defeat of the post-war strikes, the massive strike wave in 48, and then Taft-Hartley, you had this formalization of, hey, like, we're going to basically accept the terms, right? Like, as they are. We're gonna bargain for a better life for our people, but that's all we're gonna do. Like, the focus on expanding definitely starts to go away. And
I think this is interesting. I mean, I hate to give Chris Catron credit for a whole lot, but he actually does make an observation that I kind of fell into separately for him, but agree with him on. That the new left did not recognize the nature of what it was fighting, because initially it's fighting Fordism, and it's laying the groundwork for an intellectual strategy for leftists to sign on for the dismantling of the Fordist system. And one that I think is actually we romanticize Fordism in retrospect, because we know what the end of neoliberalism kind of looks like. Well, the end of the current phase of neoliberalism, maybe. I have no idea where we're at in this journey. I'm not in the business of making predictions anymore. But but there was a real critique of that. Yeah. Whereas in the South, there was already an answer to it, and it presented itself from the right, but the left was unable to really respond to it in any way. Like the unions went into a defensive modality, now trying to defend something that their intellectual forebearers, the younger people who were entering the unions from the new left, couldn't have already spent years critiquing when they were in universities or in their youth activist phase. That's a perfect storm for misrecognition, I think. How do you feel about that?
That rings true for me. I mean, and I think part of the reason they missed the problems of Fordism are actually understandable, because you have to think that many of them were either they were children of or that had come from that sort of labor aristocracy background, right? So that had been their experience, going from my dad was a factory operator to I'm able to attend university within a generation is kind of a big deal, right? And I think we can segue to where I think the South also gives the answer that the liberals pick up on, which and the liberal left generally, which is when you have the failure to unionize in the South, well, you've got to provide some way of letting lower classes or lower strata work their way up.
Mm-hmm.
Well, where do you go? The answer is education. So that's why, you know, again, like the part of that, the larger RTP project is we're going to start, you know, making this a place where people want to not only move to, but send their kids to school here so that they can be educated and then get a job in one of these high-tech industries, right? So that becomes the answer of moving out of those labor-intensive jobs, like be it tobacco, be it textiles, anything like that. That's the answer, is education.
So that builds both the land grant research school pipeline and the military pipelines explained right there. Like,
yeah.
You know, so, you know, as I've often said many times, as is done to Black people will eventually be done to most of the non-rich. Also, as is done to the South will eventually be done to most of the rest of the United States. And in some ways, this whole, like, when reading your stuff, I'm like, the South as the vanguard of regression or whatever, it really is a way to understand it. But the way that it is commonly framed in liberal discourse, and you know, you and I are not Southern chauvinists. I don't think neither one of us are particularly proud of the heritage of the part of the country we come from. But it is interesting how I still respond so negatively to the, hey, don't pretend that my region of the country is where all these sins come from, particularly when I'm out in the West, where I'm like, you know, you guys come from a religion that didn't even recognize that, like, people of color were fully ensouled until the 70s. So, like, you know, like, don't be very careful on casting those stones, right? Or if you know the actual racial history of New England and, like, particularly Boston, I mean, it's just kind of really ugly. But the South is where all this stuff is perfected. And if you look at this, like you're saying, like, we see the beginnings of neoliberalism literally from the failure of Reconstruction, and in this weird integration of this Southern agrarian, like, semi-feudal ideology, which like it never really existed. I want to, like, make that clear. I'm not arguing that the agrarian economy that people like Robert Penn Warren thought was possible was ever possible or ever actually even existed. It didn't. But that ideology was rife for intermingling with this, like, corporate personalism or paternalism. And it is interesting because that's still common in the Southeast. Like the way, like, when I worked at said unnamed large insurance company with a gecko as a mascot, I signed a no unionization bill, like, to work there. And the argument they made is that we will give you better contracts than you can get in a single unionized, or better. We didn't have contracts, but better, like, working conditions than you can get in a single unionized shop. You want to deal with us directly and not with a mediator. And that was pretty convincing to a whole lot of people for a long time. It's not so much anymore, but, like, and you know, this even like went into the public school sector. So, like, in the public schools in most of the Southeast, there either are no unions, like in Georgia. There are associations, but they're literally only lobbying associations. They can do nothing. They like here in Utah, for example, the association, I say the union, they say the association, but the association can collectively bargain but cannot strike, right? In the Southeast, they, with the exception of, like, Florida or whatever, they can't collectively bargain either. Like, so what they can do is lobby, and that's what you're paying for, a lobbying group with an insurance program, right? but there was this attitude like, look, we'll pay you more in the where we can. Now you might go to the Southeast has really poor paid teachers, and you're right. But like Georgia and North Carolina, for example, really did try to up their teacher pay to be like, oh, we don't need unions. Now your work conditions are still shit, but we're giving you a fair amount of money, particularly compared to the average cost of living and average wage in the region outside of, say, Atlanta. And that's a lot to leverage, because the other thing that I think the work of Phil Nill really overlaps with what you're talking about is the way in the 20th century, automation makes this capital more concentrated and a lot easier to move. So like a union is a real threat to these people if these businesses can move their factory, and there's no intra-state capital controls. Like there's no way for a state to go, you can't move this factory to New York or Utah or wherever. And so that's a real threat that is largely not. I'm actually kind of amazed at how leftists don't talk about this threat more thoroughly. Like it's a real reason why, like, for example, most of the unionized labor in the country is in 3 states: Hawaii, New York, and California. Like, and why is that? I mean, when people talk about like the labor strategy in the DSA and like using that to get out of the coastal corridors, and I'm like, but you can't really, because the established unions are strong there and nowhere else too. And why? I mean, and you know, again, I don't want to jump too far ahead to the future when we're talking about the current wall that the UAW strategy hit literally the week we're recording this. It'll be about 2 months old by the time, or a month and a half old when this comes out. But like in the week we're recording this, the UAW finally fucking decided, like, okay, we got to take an offensive to the Southeast for real. And they seem to be successful for the first few. And now there's been some legislative changes that have seemed to completely undermine their strategy. And so they've hit a wall. And I think it's worrisome because, as your research indicates, what happens in the South will spread to the rest of the United States, and maybe even a large part of the industrial world. Like, so to get back on that, so the 70s is where this really hits a wall. We start seeing what, you know, we might call the southernification of industrial workplaces, you know, around the country, i.e. deindustrialization with like this corporate personal model ahead of it. And I think, I do think people often miss that the faction of the Democrats that won in the 1980s were just as neoliberal as, you know, Reagan and whatnot, but not even because of like this weird, like von Hayek inspired, you know, Mount Pelerin Institute stuff that is inspiring the Reaganite conservatives and Thatcher. It is because this is the way their economies work in their home state. So Clinton comes from Arkansas, and like, that should be apparent immediately when you like look at this. It's like, it's not just an ideological project, people. It's also that's where the political economy of the winning faction of Southern Democrats come from after Lyndon Johnson. Like, you know, and I think the political ramifications of that are obvious now, but I don't know that they were obvious at the time. I mean, you know, I didn't see them. You know, I was also a high schooler, but I didn't see them in the mid-90s. Like, so what do you make of that? Like, how do you think this affected like progressive politics?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think like first, I just want to like, deindustrialization is, on the one hand, a fairly useful term, but also
it's kind of misleading. Actually,
it can be misleading because it's not that industry goes away; it's that it's automated and decentralized, right? Like, so that you need less people, right? That's what it comes down to. Like the example that you mentioned earlier about Southern automobile industries. Like, so you know, you make specific parts in small locations rather than constructing the vehicle all in the same location, right? Like that's. And then you've got another area where everything's put together again.
In fact, if I'm going to critique classical Marxism in anything, is they did not imagine that could happen. Like, if you read Engels, he clearly thinks that everything's going to be increasingly centralized forever, and that there was no, like, even though I think it's actually implied in Capital Volume 2 and 3 that there would be a weird dialectic of automation that would re-decentralize parts of the workforce. They don't, like, even though it's implied in Marx and Engels' work, or in Marx's work in Capital, it doesn't seem to be something they like cognitively picked up on, right? So like this blindsided a bunch of Marxists, just to put it like as a developmental pattern. Like Euro communists, for example, are freaking out about this. Like when you read like someone like Gortz, who's like you know, giving up on the working class almost in like almost communization theory, like out of Euro communism. They're not doing it because of supercomputers. They're doing it because of mechanical automation, like fragmenting the working class once again. And this is also why a lot of stuff like, you know, I think right now there's a pipe dream amongst a certain kind of Marxists that if we just actually get on the Trump reshoring program, that it'll return us to classical conditions of a political economy. And I see like you just shake your head in pain because like you know that's impossible now. Like, and it's impossible because it would be completely inefficient from a capitalist standpoint. There's no way they would do it. Like, so as stuff comes back, like stuff has been reshoring in the United States actually since actually the end of the Bush administration, and it just doesn't affect relative. It doesn't employ that many people. Like, so those schemas just aren't going to lead to mass re-industrial employment because deindustrialization wasn't a removal of industry. It was a decentralization and reduction of the number of people, which is totally predictable on one sense on a Marxist schema when you're like, yeah, you're trying to reduce socially necessary labor time all the time because even though it doesn't increase your profits, ultimately it increases them in the short run, and particularly when you're in legally constrained constant profit growth in the immediate sense as set up by the American shareholder system, then there's no reason not to do that at all. Like, even if in the long term it might destroy your market share or whatever.
I think you're right, and I will say it's like I won't give Marx too hard of a time on that one. You've got to have your, you know, you can't live outside your own moment too much because on the one hand he might have acknowledged it as a possibility, but it's like if you saw the dominant historical trend of the last, you know, probably I guess I'd say century, right? Like was for centralization. It's understandable that he would have missed that as a possibility.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not, to me, this is like it's a critique of Marx only in so much if you think that you can just pick up Capital Volume 1 and understand everything about the modern economy.
Okay. And that's fair. Yeah. There are a lot of Marxists that do think like, yes, if I read, like you said, just the volume 1, that's a problem. You got to read all 3 volumes. Like,
absolutely. And you probably need to read Theories of Surplus Value, and then you probably also need to read the secondary stuff after that. Like, which again is daunting. Like, I'm not like, I don't want to shame people for not devoting their lives to reading literally tens of thousands of pages of dry 19th and early 20th century prose, but like, it is a daunting project when you're talking about stuff like this, because if you just look at that early commodity production stuff in the cycle of commodities in Capital Volume 1, and you try to apply that to understanding class today, you're just going to be wrong. Like you're not going to be able to see the problematic limitations of like automation and all that on the whole system. And it does mean in some ways that like some classical Marxist strategies in the First International and the Second International are not really viable anymore. Like, and you know, particularly when you get in the Kotsky's like real optimism about like the centralization and educational skilling of the proletariat from centralized workforce seemingly infinitely Like that seems like a joke today. Like it's just kind of sad and funny. So, you know, and I think the South is a real good illustration of this. And I think the South is also a really good illustration, as you said, of like, it's not just that there's a world system with a core and periphery, or even a national system with a core and periphery. There's a regional system with a core and periphery, and that is playing itself out in how this stuff is being organized, right? Like,
yeah.
And another thing that your work illustrates, and I want to give you credit for this, is you pick up on how relations of production via racialization and other things affect directly the mode of production, which is obvious in Marx, and yet it's something Marxists just fucking drop all the time. Like they're not looking at the legal relationship of the production, because I think they're mistaking something as superstructural as just epiphenomenal and non-important, you know, which is just wrong. Like, so 70s happened. We got that. We talked a little bit about the 80s. When do you think the, say, Southernification into neoliberalism really gets booming? It seems to have its core in these problems in the 70s, but like, when do we see it accelerate?
I would honestly say the 90s. That's really like the sort of high point of, I think that's really the high point of neoliberalism. If we really wanted,
agreed.
Like, I think pretty much the Bush years are the end of neoliberalism, and we've just been, you know, living in its corpse ever since.
In this weird zombie. I mean, in some ways, it's interesting to me because, you know, Fordism took a long time to die. I mean, it was really only dominant from like, say, 47, you know, the end of the war into maybe 61, 62. But it doesn't.
The early 60s recession really
is
starts to kill off Fordism.
Right. Early 60s recession, and then the Japanese and Germans entering the commodity market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it's like, it makes Fordism a much more untenable project. And then when you look at that, you're like, damn, that's actually not even, it's barely a generation. It is the generation that sets the norm for a massive amount of people because it happens to correspond with the baby boom. But it's barely a generation. Whereas also when we look at the height of neoliberalism, it's like, okay, even if you date it to like 77, which is probably where I date it as a national project, like maybe the second year of the Carter administration. It's over, I think, by I think 9/11 puts a real big dent in it, in that first little commodity bubble that blows up right before 9/11. Then the economic fallout from 9/11 itself happens. So we don't really pay attention to that first commodity bubble burst. And then, you know, the securities thing happens in the home market, and it really becomes obvious how much this is based off of like computerized securities and whatnot, that even leftists like Baudrillard see as like solving the problem of the business cycle and of the capitalist contradictions. And it's like, no, it's actually just accelerating it because all the priors are built into the automation. Right. And it kind of accelerates this speed up to this blow up that we've been living through. But it's become clear to me that our erstwhile leaders don't have a consensus on the solution to the problem like they arrived at neoliberalism. And the arrival of neoliberalism, again, is kind of over-determined because you have the Southern thing and then you have the separate intellectual project that happens to be able to glom onto it in the Mount Pelerin Society. Like, okay. So the 90s happens.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I think we underestimate how bad the 90s was for the labor movement. Because the labor movement in all the U.S. starts to look like the labor movement in the South, from my opinion, in the 1990s. Like, in the 1980s, like, interestingly, we only keep formal stats on a lot of this stuff starting in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, you're still dealing with like 35% private sector union density or something. It's actually quite high for the United States. It's not high historically for like Europe, but like, it's fairly high. And by the end of the 1990s, you're looking at like 10, 14, somewhere in there. It was like incredibly low level. Like the union density had been cut down by half, like in the spectrum of like 15 years.
Yeah, and it's basically stayed within that since, between that 10 and 15% range ever since. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And it seems like we only realized it in like 2011. Like, it's, a lot of, you're talking about this, and maybe this is a cautionary tale about like both holding people to accountable for like, yeah, we can't hold Marx accountable for developmental patterns that might be implicit in his own work, but we're nowhere near historically obvious, right? But I think that's also true for our responses to things like Fordism or neoliberalism, that we're often drawing conclusions like and over extrapolating like techno neo-feudalism or whatever, or somehow this brand new development. And it's like, no, if you actually look at things, like some of the stuff has been around for like 100 years within capitalism itself, and it's just coming to become more dominant now, or came to be more dominant during the neoliberal period or whatever. So I guess this we can tie this into union organizing today. Our left organizing today. There's been a lot of hay made about the UAWs, really, and Sean Fain's like more strategic, more aggressive, rank and file oriented strategy, even though he's pretty, he's made a lot of like symbolic kowtowing to the Biden administration and the Democratic Party. And it's been pretty effective in finally get the auto unions to start trying to breach the Mason-Dixon border, like that really the UAW has just respected since the 70s for some reason, to its own massive decline, as made obvious in 2007. But it's hitting a wall, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, as these southern states are passing state level legislation that seem to be, unable for the NCLB to bypass for whatever reason, probably constitutional. I am actually not quite sure. It's some of these are also so new that their constitutionality remains unadjudicated. So, and given the current makeup of the court, not likely to go in labor's favor. But we're seeing like the renewal of, for example, like these passages in 3 or 4 southern states that are all but card check blocks. Like you have to have like secret ballot votes, and there's a high threshold of what you can do, and the fear of that alone is causing the UAW salting attempts in the Southeast to just dry up. Like, so they had their first loss, and it looks like these bills are spreading throughout the Southeast, which is going to make it much harder. Do you think that we have historically underestimated, because of the view as the South is just backwards, the kind of evil ingenuity of the Southern like political elite and setting up anti-union legislation? Like, what do you think about that? Like,
I think we've definitely underestimated it. And I mean, and going back to the unionization drives of the 70s, even if this legislation is found to be unconstitutional, it can hang around long enough to do enough damage to organizing efforts. So even if it is found to be unconstitutional, in the long run, it's going to do so much damage to that potential militancy that's already existing. Like, I mean, I don't think they need to be successful in order to be successful.
Yeah, well, this is the irony of our current age, right? Like, and I keep on telling people they really need to answer this more seriously than they are. And I want to give you some credit for this, because the Jacobin thinkers about this, there's one of them that I think is responsible, and that's Ben Fong, because he's very aware of labor history. But everyone else seems to be like kind of in a delusional cycle of like, well, we can get logistics. Oh shit, that didn't work. Well, we can get Service sectors. Oh shit, that's really hard for logistics reasons because it's so fragmented and shops are so small, et cetera, et cetera. The workers are temporary, or at least they're the whole thing's basically one of the ironies whenever people say, well, those jobs aren't meant to be lifelong, you know, you're supposed to just do it for one period of time. I'm like, well, isn't it weird that you basically have this sector of the working class that even you guys think should be transient within your own culture and within your own state just by age? Like, that's bizarre. Like, because if there's any change in like even age demographics, of which there's a massive one happening right now, that becomes an untenable position. Like, so it does seem like right now we're putting a whole lot on particularly the auto industry. And I've had some things to say about this. This is not a critique of the UAW, but it is sort of like, guys, the auto industry is a dying industry. And honestly, its biggest competitor is actually communist China, which I don't really think is communist, but they do. So it's going to put the UAW in a weird position in regards to international labor and in regards to things like green transition in like the logistics fleet. And it is like, it's a very like, it's not that the UAW's come out against it, it's like, but it's a real problematic question for them.
It is. And I do think that is partly why you've seen the UAW expand into so many other industries outside of automobile. Like, I mean, you even had the UAW involved with like the graduate student unions,
that's right? The biggest expansion, honestly.
But like they've unionized janitorial services and things. There's a lot, but I think there's some recognition that the party can't last forever.
Right. And I think we're seeing that wall hit. So I want to ask you a little bit, though. This has come up a little bit. Is the liberal half recognition or misrecognition of this? So there is a narrative that's a very liberal political ideological narrative that like really somehow the South like hid behind the whole time. And with Reagan, they snuck up and they installed the counter-revolutionary like post-Civil War regime in the whole nation. Like, that's the liberal narrative. And if you just got rid of the South, this would go away. Like, you've seen it every fucking 4 years. There's like this, if we get rid of most of the United States from the United States, our political problems will be solved. And I think that is absurd. So let's, but I do see it as a half recognition. Like, they see some of these trends. They can't explain them except in a political ideological manner, because they're not going to look at the
or along cultural lines too. Like, right. I mean, you're right. Like, oh, it's Southern culture, it's backwards. Like that's where you get into the question of the rural urban divide. Everybody who in the South is just a bunch of backwards morons. And
missing like the research triangle, Atlanta, the development in Tampa, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that a lot of the intellectual labor of the country actually goes on in the Southeast. But also like it has unintended and very fucked up racial implications and stuff too. Like, there's a whole like, oh, so you want to kick out the places with the largest concentration of people of color, except for like Southern California. Like, it's, and like, you're not looking at that at all. Like, it's a weird response, but it does seem to come out of what you're talking about, where people can kind of see this stuff. They can't articulate it. They're not looking at it in political economic terms. They're not looking at it in historical material terms. So like, all they recognize is, oh, the rest of the country looks a lot more like the South. The South is backward. The rest of the country is backward. It must be because the South is like politically instantiating its ideology upon us through Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump, a Californian and a New Yorker. Like, and George W. Bush, a Connecticut New Englander who just learned how to fake a Texas accent. Like, I don't know. It might not be fake at this point, but it was probably fake at one point. I've heard him talk in the 80s. You know, like, because when people often ask me, you know, like, well, isn't George W. Bush a Southerner? I'm like, yes and no. Like, he's not, he was born in Connecticut, man. Like,
no, admittedly, Derek, I was born in New York, but I only spent 2 years in New York. Out of my 33 years of existence. So for all intents and purposes, all of my memories are of the South.
So you are a carpetbagger gone native. Got it.
Yeah, there you go.
Man, one day I'm going to get in the carpetbagger discourse because there's some really messed up stuff implied in that. But no, I mean, there's been several. There's also been one of the things that happened in the 90s that's been overlooked because it kind of got undone in a way for parts of the South, but not all of it. In the 2000s was like this great remigration, both of people of color and of large swaths of people from like Michigan and Ohio back into the Southeast, because that economy had really already adjusted to these current conditions because they were pioneered there. So it looked like there was more work there. Now, when the housing market, blew up, what you saw is like a fragmentation of that labor force. So it's like things went well in Atlanta, things went well in Savannah. And like I said, we mentioned earlier, any place where there's a military base, things are still doing okay because there's these downstream privatized production economies that actually do massive scale, high-end industrial production for the military. But in general, the Southeast went from like absorbing a lot of labor that had been pushed out of the deindustrialized, in quotation marks, Midwest into the Southeast, and then they got fucked immediately again because the housing crisis kind of destroyed a whole lot of the production economy of the Southeast. However, it's coming back. That is where today the dominant amount of new factories and stuff that are being reshored are opening up is in the Southeast and in the West. Texas, Georgia, not to a lesser degree, Florida, but not actually as much, the Carolinas, etc. Now the like real hinterland of the South, like Upper Appalachia and like Mississippi and the Delta Basin, that's still too poor to be really useful for a skilled labor force, to be quite frank. And so that part of the South is still getting left behind. But like right now, the Southern economy looks to be doing a little better than the New England and Californian economy relative to its size. I mean, whereas the Californian economy is doing okay, I guess. It tends to be like for people who know regional trends, the California economy tends to be like hyper cyclic. So whatever the cycle of the United States is at, California is doing, like when the U.S. is doing well, California is doing way better. And when the U.S. is doing shitty, it looks like the California economy is just going to collapse. And New York is weirder because of the financialization of the economy, but it is the last major city that has a forest infrastructure left. Like the New York State still has a lot of those forest infrastructure laws. Even the bankruptcy of New York City didn't get rid of them. And they're only really, ironically, being attacked now by Southern governors through immigration stunts, which is aimed at like sharing the burden of dealing with the immigrants. But what it's actually doing, and I don't think that the Southern governors are doing this on purpose. They're not thinking this through. But what it's actually doing is destroying like the forest infrastructure that New York City has to deal with the homeless population. And it's overtaxing it, and it's creating in some segments of Philly, New York, and that like Rust Belt, New England, like overlap corridor. A lot of racial tensions between immigrants and black people that is pushing parts of the black voting population towards the Republicans. And again, if we studied the Southeast, we could probably see this happening. Yeah. But since people don't, because I guess the South is a useful ideological scapegoat, right, for all these American problems, we are not seeing how this is rippling throughout the entire country again. Like, is that? Do you see that?
Yeah,
like,
no, and because I feel like we're having the discourse on immigration up in the Northeast the same way that it happened in the 90s and early aughts. Like, if you remember how much of a big deal that the conversation around immigration from Central America was, like, that was like all the conversation, right? Like, and North Carolina happens to be outside of the Southwest, one of the most dense Latino populations in the country. And so, like, a lot of these Southern governors, they're shooting themselves in the foot anyway, like, in the long term, because, like, it's so much the backbone. That work is so much the backbone of a lot of these industries that we've previously talked about, because, quite frankly, nobody else wants to do that work. Or,
right.
Like,
no one dreams of having their finger cut off in a chicken factory.
No.
Like
absolutely not. No. And or working on one of these massive, like, pig farms, like, dealing with pig shit all day, like,
right.
No,
or an oil refinery, or like I think about the stuff in the Southern economy, and it's like, these are the shittiest industrial jobs, like, they are, like,
right.
The exception really is the Southern auto industry. Like, those jobs are relatively good comparatively, because, like, but it's because they're super automated and whatnot. Like, so they don't hire that many people. They kind of don't.
And for a time, they're like niche, like luxury, for example, like furniture production for a time was like a place where you could, like, make a decent living as a factory operative, right? Like, but as that furniture became more cheaply made, for all the reasons we've already discussed, that dried up. And, like, I used an example in that piece that I sent you of an interview with a former operative in a furniture plant, and she basically said, my options were to go to a worse plant, or I could work fast food, and that was it. And that's, like, I think that's the reality, is, like, people are getting pushed out into either these shitty manufacturing jobs, these shitty retail jobs, or these shitty logistics jobs. And I think, like, anybody, I will say, overall, I tend to be on the more optimistic side about labor, but I also don't see that it's going to be an easy thing. Like, I don't see that there's any easy answer. I've been involved with trying to unionize a workplace in the South. It did not end well. I've told this story before, but basically we staged a walkout during COVID. They put us on leave for 2 weeks, and when we came back, they're like, "You guys can't work on the same shift together ever again." And that was that. And that pretty much killed the union drive.
Yeah, well, this is one of the things that I talk about, like, a lot, is the public sector unions have two strategic advantages. One, they're actually kind of weirdly more protected now because of federal involvement. But two, and this is something that people miss, most public sector institutions are still factory lined, drawn up. So schools, hospitals, and whatnot are still highly concentrated labor. I think Gabriel Wenite goes into good work on proving why that is. Like, why did that happen? But in a real way, like the social reproductive services, healthcare and childcare, which is what schooling kind of really is, if we're honest. It's not really about education anymore. Probably hasn't been for a while. And we saw that when conservatives,
and I dare say, Derek, higher education as well.
Yeah, well,
increase. If we include that in there, I just,
Higher education is a way to charge people for the skills that before the 1980s they would have got in a public school and a high school if they could get through it. I mean, the way we've gotten the graduation rate up in the United States is increasing literacy at the low end. We really have done that. Things have gotten better. But really giving up on high-end literacy being taught in secondary school at all. Like, we just pass that up to the universities, and you're basically meaning people pay for it. And we're in a weird position right now, like in regards to higher education. Like, all this PMC talk is like a fundamental like misrecognition, because I'm like, okay, on one hand, we have more people with college degrees in the United States than we've ever had. It's over 50%.
Yes.
On the other hand, colleges are dying institutions in the sense that their educational mission is less and less because they're having trouble attracting domestic students. They are. So even though we have this boom of people with degrees, in a weird sense, it's also mean that degrees no longer help you as much as they used to. They're not as big as a distinction factor for the reasons why you're saying. And it's a way to delay people entering into the workforce, which keeps which, you know, is a very expensive way for both the state and individuals to stay out of unemployment. But it's very expensive. And a lot of people, including a lot of states, have just decided it's not worth it anymore. So there's that. I mean, I agree with you with that. I think there's also something else there that we have to look at, though, which is like, you know, you're a graduate student. You had a union impossible factory-esque job. And this is the other thing about the PMC thesis is I'm like, well, there's tons of people who've entered what traditionally was the non-skilled workforce, either because of the 90s and aughts credentialing drift, where like, I remember living through this when I worked at said unnamed insurance company with a giant lizard as the thing. Like, more and more stuff that didn't even require a college degree. Even when I started in 2003, by the time I left in 2005, like, was requiring graduate degrees and shit. Like, it was crazy how fast the credentialing race like went up. So much so that they were even like, the companies were paying money to like credentialize their own workforce just to meet their own internal certifications, which tells me that it was worth it to them to limit the job pool for something like even at the cost of like educating, other work members and essentially stuff that was somewhat superfluous to them. I do see that being slightly undone just because the lack of domestic labor, so decredentialization is on the horizon in a lot of these industries. But I think a lot of people think that's going to create a massive workforce for unions. And I think that might be why we see so much militancy right now.
Yeah.
I do. Because you have people who are trained with skills and a knowledge of history meeting up with people who aren't and joining together, which in some ways means that this focus on the PMC question is weirdly anti-solidaristic within the working class itself. Which is not to say that there isn't a problem of professionalization and management and petite bourgeois values. I actually separate those out, because they're not, to me, they don't actually all rhyme. But because you can't really convince me that like an industrial worker in the Southeast in management and like an auto plant, even though they're probably highly educated, really gives a shit about a DI initiative the way like us, a business that's doing it for that's selling to the public as opposed to selling to other industry. And I think that's kind of an interesting problem for us as a period of recognition. And while like I'm probably more in short term pessimistic on labor than you, I think in the long term, my conclusion is this labor militancy is actually very real, and that a lot of the legal barriers that are likely to be exacerbated in any future conservative administration, be it Trump or otherwise, is going to make that militancy harder, and it might actually further break up contemporary political coalitions. But as of right now, it is not clear where any of that goes, because the Democrats are not using, like, even though Biden's for a Democrat, Biden is okay on labor. I think there's been a lot of even DSA people overpraising him, but like it's just because the bar is incredibly low after Nixon. But in the long run, it looks like there's some real hindrances coming up, but it also looks like there's a bipartisan scramble to catch some of this disenfranchised labor militancy, like for real. Like Josh Hawley pulling pro-labor stunts is an indication that this militancy is real, because otherwise they would not care. So I guess this leads me to a question. As a person who thinks a lot about political strategy, you're involved in political strategy a little bit, and that's in some ways why you've done this Southern research question, right? It's to you haven't said as much, but it seems to be the revive a political strategy to deal with these changes. What do you see as a viable strategy for dealing with these changes that doesn't underestimate this rump Southern politicians who seem to be able? I mean, they seem to be really on the offensive against both liberals and the left in a way that the left seems fundamentally unable to deal with. So how would we strategize for that?
That's the $1 million question, and I don't know if I have a great formulation quite yet. But I think, like, first and foremost, I think, like, this question that often, or when you start to get in conversations about Southern organizing, immediately, the question comes of the legality of organizing, right, and collective bargaining. I think, like, we're going to have to start to really be prepared to get in to blur those lines of legality, and be willing to work outside the law, like, quite frankly, because that's the only way that, in my mind, that we're going to be able to expand. And I think thinking beyond terms of just like collective bargaining as it exists, and that's very abstract. As the immediate, like, where my gut tells me to go. But on the ground, I think, like, having as much part of the DSA strategy that I do appreciate towards labor is this, basically creating a volunteer networks of organizers organically. Like, I do think that is a useful strategy. The problem is, like, how do you fund that in the long term? Because traditionally it's come out of funding from other unions, like in their in this example, or in the example of EWOC, it comes out of the UAW, or not, excuse me, the UE, and then increasingly they've moved towards sort of a voluntary dues system to fund it. I don't know if that is a long-term sustainable project. I really don't, but I do think it's better than what has been tried before, which is creating a similar network by just sending down paid organizers, spending like a $90,000 or $90,000 on a salary for an organizer to try to work on an individual campaign. I think creating the understanding how separate things are and how decentralized things are is the first step there, and part of it is going to have to be relying on a lot of voluntary work. Now, again, that's how do you sustain that in the long run? I'm not there yet.
Well, this is an interesting question for me, because on one hand, I find that leftist organizations that prematurely professionalize their staff, such as the DSA, often destroy themselves. because they have large bureaucratic apparatuses and people with labor rights. And I've had people push back on like, well, why does the DSA have a union? It should have an unregulated labor. And I'm like, dude, if you're arguing that like the people who push for labor regulations themselves can't have it, what you're actually saying is that, you're actually saying that that is not a viable model. Like overall, you don't realize that that's what you're saying, but that's what you're saying. However, on the same note, there's no way an organization like the DSA can maintain a massive staff, and whether, particularly when it's basing its stuff off of projections of membership that are kind of distorted in the first place. But that's not the only place we see this. Like, the over-reliance on professional organizers for assaulting have also led to the over-dominance of professional organizers in the union, and that alienates workers. And I think we saw that in the 70s. I think one of the components of the 70s that people always think is like, you hear people talk about the 70s as if the negative reaction to labor bureaucracy was completely a neoliberal ideological construction, and it fooled all the workers. And my response is like, bullshit. Like, no, they were legitimately angry about stuff happening within the unions themselves and the union's own concession to the corporations. That was organic. It was and neoliberal seized on that. But if it wasn't already there, it wouldn't have worked. Like, people aren't just duped by new ideas. Like, they just are enforced upon them like a mind virus. That's some liberal nonsense, and we need to stop it. Like,
no, talk to anybody who was like in their late 20s, maybe early 30s in the 70s, like that was like in the workforce at the time. They'll talk about the corruption in the unions. They'll talk about it like that was a real issue. And there's a reason why there was reform movements in the 70s within the unions. Like, so to say like, again, that people were completely duped is to ignore that there were actual problems in unions. And I think, like, to go back to an earlier point, I think we also just need to acknowledge that the structure of unionization in this country is based on a flawed model in the first place. Like, it was basically concessionary. Like, we gave up too much power to capital when we formalized collective bargaining the way that we did.
Sectional bargaining, for all of its limitations that we've seen in Italy, would still be a way better basis to operate off of than, say, shop site bargaining or whatever the fuck we have. Like, like, even in the same organization, like I pointed this out with like the federal nature of like something like the NEA. In some states, the NEA is basically a guild union, and some are the whatever the branch is, and in some states it's not. And sometimes it's even regionally variant within the same state, like because of the different charters, the way those charters interact with law, the way that the other thing that we haven't mentioned, but it should be made obvious because it finally came to the forefront during the Biden administration, is how many fucking carve-outs to the National Labor Relations Act are in it and have never been addressed for the entirety of the 20th century. Like, the only major carve-out that was ever addressed was the allowance for public sector unions at all. Like, it doesn't even apply the NCLB protections to those unions, but at least it allows them to exist. That was made in the 70s. But other than that, like, there has been, because the government ironically exempted itself from union organization until the 70s, and until it was forced by a bunch of Rowcat strikes, basically, to recognize it, ironically under Nixon. I think people miss that. And I also think, like, we have to do, like, I'm not saying that we should become a legalist in the union.
No.
But I am sort of like, we kind of have to become a legalist. Like it's just like, we can't be worried about that. Or, I'll give Sean Fain a bit of where I see his brilliance, for example, using the fact that the UAW actually organizes TAs for a way to actually say politically intervene in aid of Palestinian solidarity actions and campuses, because it actually affects it. Because otherwise, that would, if they weren't organizing TAs, that would be illegal under Taft-Hartley. So I'll give Sean Fain, like he finds ways around the law. But what we are seeing is fine, and it's in the southern states. Again, to bring it back to your points, so are they. Like it is not just one-sided. This is a red green game, and both sides are playing it. And because a lot of the left just doesn't understand, focus, or care about the Southeast, they don't see this happening until it's already too late. I shouldn't say they don't care about the Southeast. There's more discussions of like, you know, a neo Operation Dixie or whatever, but like, it's not like, if you look at like the DSA base, there aren't massive DSA chapters in the South. Like when I was in the aughts, when I was looking for socialist organizations, when I realized it was a socialist and I was in Georgia, there were none.
Yeah.
Like the SPUSA wasn't there. The CPUSA may have been there. The only option that I had was the ISO or SALT at the time. Or maybe the PSL if I really wanted to like start my own chapter. Like that's different now, but it's still kind of amazing how like non-penetrative this stuff is. And even when it does penetrate, it is like, you know, there have been DSA victories in southern cities, but they've been in like really shut out southern cities like Jackson, Mississippi. And they have not been able to expand beyond those borders. Like they're very curtailed into like these highly educated and or very, very, very deracinated areas, either where you have a fairly educated workforce or where like the entire city's shut out of it having a functional economy. And it hasn't been able to go past that. And I think like that's a real barrier. Because when everybody talks about, you know, you still hear this like, oh, red states, they're not actually as reactionary as you think. That's a socialist thing. You know, most people in red states actually sign up to like 80% of the Bernie platform if you ask it in the right way. That last point's important. You do have to ask it in the right way. And that's true. But there's been no ability to capsize off, to like develop off that. And one of the things that I think people miss about this, and I think this is funny, but there's a lot of anger in the South, not just at the progressive Democrats. There's a lot of anger at the Dixiecrats that still extends to the Democrats to this day that is not really tapped into or even understood. Like, when did North Carolina get its first Republican governor? I don't remember, but that's what I'm asking. In Georgia, it was 2000. Like,
gosh, that's a good question. Actually, I'm trying to think. Was it the 80s or 90s?
Like, I think North Carolina got it before.
Yeah, I see. I've got a friend of mine's head in my face in my head right now, wagging his finger at me. How don't you know this? I've done this work, but no, I'm blanking on the exact year. But I believe it was in the 80s or the early 90s. But I could be wrong on that.
So this is interesting. There have been 69 governors of North Carolina with 75 terms. The great majority of them have been Democrats.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me see if I can find the first Republican is in 70, actually.
Okay, 70. Okay. It was earlier.
The rest of the Tidewater South was much later. But you don't have a major. He's not a conservative Republican. You don't have a conservative Republican until 1985. So
that's what I was thinking. Okay.
Yeah. Right. Whereas in Georgia, our first Republican is Sonny Perdue, and that's like 2000. And what happened is the Dixiecrats literally worked out they actually met with the Congressional Black Caucus and worked out something. And then most of them switched they just changed party affiliation. They didn't like, it wasn't even like what is crazy when I talk about Georgia, it wasn't even that a Republican legislature was voted in. The same legislature was voted in and shifted from Democrat to Republican with the governor. Like, it was wild. And I think that tells you a little bit more about the Democratic Party and the kind of deal with the devil that has been made going all the way back to William Jennings Bryan. We can't even blame this all on like the Popular Front in the 1940s. No. Like, it goes way back. And I think Clinton and Obama, because in a lot of ways Obama is still an ideological successor to the Clinton administration, even though we don't like to look at that very directly. They are the culminations of this in a lot of ways. Like, and now that that's over, one of the reasons for the chaos in trying to figure out the electoral coalitions of the country is the regional coalitions no longer make sense. Like it's not clear. Like Southern Republicans are too scary for the majority of the U.S. to vote for. And California Democrats are universally hated outside of California. So like, where are you going to go? Like, it's an interesting problem.
Anyway, I think this question of Southern Democrats, even beyond like the question of the Dixiecrats, is like, you had many like on the question of cultural issues and these and moral questions of race that would support desegregation, but like otherwise be in favor of things that would keep those racial divisions in line anyway. Like, you know, I call them like, you know, basically the business first Democrats, right? Like that's their prerogative, is what's good for business is good for North Carolina. You know, consequences be damned on, you know, again, maintaining the majority of North Carolina as a backwater for, you know, these rich enclaves. So I think there is a resentment there, right? That exists to those people or towards those people, not because they're outright, you know, segregationists or racists, but because their actions are either, you know, intentionally maintaining this, or if not, you know, they're turn a blind eye towards what's happening or what continues to happen in the state. I tend to, my personal feelings is that I tend to think about the Democrats in the South as spineless. I mean, that's my, that's the word I tend to use.
And when they have a spine, it's usually for the worst things. But I mean, to me, in a way, it's interesting because I do think people underestimate how much influence that coterie of Democrats has, because, and this is what people miss, and when they talk about a lot of this, is from the electoral strategy of the Democratic Party, they got to either get, they have to reclaim the industrial Midwest, or they have to reclaim the South to win an electoral coalition. And they're not going to do that in a radical way. Like, for example, like Biden makes a big deal of his appeal to the black electorate in like South Carolina. And I just like to point out, I'm like, but that's the most conservative black electorate in the Democratic coalition. Like, it is like, he's not making appeal to the black electorate in Chicago, which is much more enfranchised and a little bit more radical. Like, it's an appeal to, and why is it conservative? It's not because black people in the South are inherently more conservative, it's because a lot of them can't vote, like, because of felon laws and drug charges. And that's not been fixed. Like,
and apathy.
And apathy. And, you know, who the fuck can blame them? Like,
no, 100%. 100%. No, yeah.
Like, when people ask me, like, why do working class people not vote? I'm like, when have progressives even ever delivered on anything they promised? So, like, what? Like, when you keep on saying they vote against their interests, well, if you actually did what you said, maybe they wouldn't vote that way. But since it never happens, whether you're sincere or not, why is that an illogical presumption, right? Like, and particularly when it's their Democrats in their states that are doing the sabotaging. Like, so why would they ever trust you? Like, I don't know. Like, it makes total sense to me. And I know I've made this point like for years, but like, I do kind of think that a left that matters has to be fundamentally hostile and antagonistic to the Democratic Party, even if it might tactically sometimes vote for a Democrat on a local level for reasons of like influence or whatever. Because I'm not saying that we should never vote at all. But like the overall orientation, like if the main of the Democratic Party is not attacking us, we're kind of not doing our job.
Yeah.
Like I kind of like, maybe you disagree with me, but
and I think the reason, and I don't want to attribute everything to geography, but just growing up in the South, I just think that's, to me, something that's just like inherently obvious, that you can't trust the Democrats, and you wouldn't want, and quite frankly, they're not working within our interests. And I think maybe the reason why that's not the majority socialist opinion is because of
they're from the Northeast and the West Coast.
Exactly. So they're coming from a very different historical background than we are. Like, just that. And so I get where they're coming from, but I think they're also, the fact that as we've already noted, unions have been on their back foot for the last 50 years. Maybe we should reconsider who our allies are, and maybe we should reconsider. I mean, a big thing is a lot of how much union money goes towards campaigning for Democrats,
of which they get so little back. It is totally a real guard defensive measure based out of fear. Like, I mean, I know I'm going to sound really controversial in this. The Teamsters recently got a lot of shit for giving money to both sides of an electoral campaign, both Democrats and Republicans, in one of the states. I think it was Josh Hawley's state. And I was like, and it was somewhere where the Republicans are clearly going to win. And everyone was like, oh, it's red, brown. And I'm like, they're trying to have political influence. They're not trying to win an ideological battle. Yeah. So asking them to be loyal to progressive Democrats when the progressive Democrats can't win their state is fucking stupid. Like, and yet we've done that for years, and the progressive Democrats have never paid it back to the unions anyway. Like, the most you've gotten is these kind of paltry concessions under Biden through administrative fiat in the NCLB, and administrative fiat is the weakest way to change things, because the moment you have a different president, even within the same party, it can go away. Like,
and that also ignores how long that's been going on. By the way, the example of giving money to both sides. I mean, obviously the majority of the money that the unions that are a part of the AFL-CIO give to Democrats, but they absolutely have given to Republican candidates, and they would be stupid not to.
Exactly. Like, I mean, like, duh. Like corporations give to both candidates. Why shouldn't unions? Come on, dipshit. Like, if you're dealing with an inherently corrupting system, the fact that you would play both sides is like, honestly, I kind of think everyone should be assuming everyone's playing both sides about everything. But like, it just seems like it would be dumb not to. You put yourself at a strategic disadvantage against capital, like, because they are going to play both sides and historically have. And they have a lot more. Now, unions have a lot more non-liquid wealth than we tend to like to admit, because they have all these property holdings, but it isn't particularly liquid. It is hard, particularly as interest rates are high, for them to utilize that. But so I don't want to, like, it's actually one of these strange things when you look at the money, and maybe, I have a friend of mine who's always telling me to be more vulgar Marxist. And I'm like, vulgar Marxism is stupid, except for one thing. Look at how the funding actually plays out. Like, if you want to understand why the educational institutions are weird about Palestine, it's not even about the Israeli donors. They don't want people to realize that they're basically landlords that have like a school attached to it for historical reasons. Like that, like in the revenue sphere, the universities make most of their money off of profiteering off of healthcare, and then they make the next set of money off of profiteering off of land speculation and rents. Like, in that, and then the third part of their money is government grants, usually for the military, which means that the vast majority of their income does not come from their actual mission at all. And I think even, that's been my big thing, even more than like losing, Zionist donors, which are actually still a drop in the bucket. You look at like the exposure of what these schools actually are. Well, similarly with some of these unions, the reason why it took them a long time to develop a rank and file strategy is that they didn't financially need to. Like, it took 2007, ironically, to really decimate that old corrupt leadership. I mean, we talk about the UAW. That used to be the worst union in America. Like, I mean, like most of the UAW's like aughts and 90s leadership is in prison. Like it's like Sean Fain and that coterie played a long game to return rank and file unionism to a union that had it like a long time ago, but hadn't had it since the 50s. Like, right. And in some ways had a reputation for being the most bureaucratically corrupt. So in a way, and I say that because I end on to turn this over to you on a slight note of hope. The Sean Fain strategy there does indicate that, yeah, you can beat the worst parts of these unions in these crises if you know how to take advantage of the situation. Yeah. And the problem with the situation in the South is the way that we've mostly handled it is professional assaulting, which is, I think, always going to have severe limitations. Like, it's seen as outsider imposition, if nothing else, because, I mean, you and I both know one thing about the South is like, partly because of the Civil War, it does not really trust other regions of the country. Like, and that's even down to like progressive oriented people. Like, I have to remind myself to like drop my instinctual hatred of New York. Like, it's just like, it's in there. I see it as like I see New York as like an empire getting its octopus hands in my like, and like, I have to be like, no, don't be a Southern chauvinist. Like, it is true that as a fiscal core of the country and is awful, but it has nothing to do with most of the things to do in New York. But that's a hard thing to like break yourself of if that's been your socialization for most of your life. Like, and I think people underestimate that in the Southeast, and also how resentful the Southern exception as the proof of the progressiveness of America, because we're really the evil, dirty, racist ones and everybody else is perfectly fine and good. That gets really resented, because I used to have like people from Ohio who would go to my school tell me how racist the South was. And I'm like, motherfucker, the only time I've seen a Klan rally in my life was outside of Dayton. Like, and there was Klan active in like my town when I was a kid and outside of Macon, Georgia. But like, they would not come out in public. Like, like, much less have a massive rally. And then don't give me this shit that there's no like racism when I see as many stars and bars in Ohio, which has no excuse. Like there is that, like, you could be an idiot in the South and not realize what you're signifying. You can't really now, but you could in the 80s and 90s. You can't say that in Ohio or Idaho or any of that shit. Like, there's only one thing that can possibly
see that in upstate New York. I mean, Jesus, right. Like, Jesus Christ. Yeah. Like, no. And I think, there's a certain resentment there. I think there's also just, when you send people from outside the South, I don't think they quite understand what to do with the South. And like, they just don't understand how to completely, mesh within that, within that culture, that we're talking about. And so like, it's just a non-starter from the beginning. So building up organic people who know, I think like probably you and I know this as very educated people, is that there's a lot of code switching that goes on. Like you know, I can talk to just about anybody, and I interact with people like of all walks of life. So and part of that is just being exposed to all that. But like, if you don't have that ability to do that because you weren't brought up, one, within the culture of the South, but also two, like you're not necessarily aware of people outside of your cultural bubble. Because I think a lot of the issue too, one of the bigger differences between, let's say, urban areas in the Northeast and the South is like you have that massive suburban sprawl of the South, whereas if you live in an urban area in the Northeast, yes, there is sprawl. I'm not saying like everything's compacted, but there is a more centralized city in a sense that does not exist in the South, where I can be driving, from my house and be surrounded by basically civilization, and then 10 minutes down the road it's hog farms, right? Like it's that's something that I just don't think people who live in that part of the country understand. If you're not from here, you won't get it.
Yeah, it's hard for me to explain. Like, okay, so in the Northeast, cities have like historical neighborhoods, and they actually belie a weird history of informal segregation, but nonetheless they exist. Like there's Little Egypt in New York, blah 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 blah. Like those don't exist in the Southeast. Like even the black and white parts of town, they're like intersecting in weird streets where the street name changes, and like it's very not. Like if you're imagining segregation in the South as like there's a black part of town and there's a white part of town and there's a rich part of town and there's a poor part of town, it's by street, not even by like
100% by street. Yeah.
It's not even by like sector of the city anymore, and hardly ever was. And like I remember thinking that downtowns were things that small towns had, because in the South, like small town, like downtowns existed in small towns, but like Atlanta or even a place like Macon. Like the downtown core was dead for most of the. I mean, it's been revitalized now as like a commuter apartments for people in Atlanta, but like in general, like there is no city core. There's like nested peripheries within these cities, and when you move to like even to some of like which I'm gonna pick a working class town as opposed to New York. That's not true. Like it's very clear, like centers of life, and the West is a little bit more like the South. Like fuck, if there's a center core to Phoenix, Arizona, like it's like or even some places in California, but like the dominant model seems to be based off of like basically mid-century New England assumptions, that also the fact that we're highly captive in like the U.S. left is basically strong in 4 cities: New York, Chicago, Seattle, and the large conglomeration of Southern California. I know we associate the Bay Area with the left. I think the left there has largely been priced out, to be quite honest. So that's a different scenario. And I guess Portland, which is weird because Portland's weird. In this, and when I don't mean weird and if it's cool. I mean weird and then like it's a liberal enclave in what is otherwise Greater Idaho, and also is one of the weirdestly whitest part of the countries, because it's literally off of a white supremacist colony that has a relationship to the Klan. That's how it's founded. So like it's a very strange place for progressivism to kind of. So I guess I'll include it. But in general, like outside of like those 8 or 9 urban areas, there's a lot of left sentiment, particularly in urban areas, but there's not a lot of left organization because there's not a long historical tradition and institutions for these people to join in on easily. So it does lead to interesting things. Like I've made the argument that the DSA in the South was always more radical than the DSA in the DSA strongholds, because like it has to be. It can't imagine that there's a way to manipulate Democrats into power in like New Orleans or in Atlanta. They know better. Yeah. But well, maybe in Atlanta you can get confused now, but historically speaking, whereas in New York, well, I mean, the DSA has been a caucus, like an unofficial caucus in the New York Senate since the fucking 80s. Like it gives you a very different picture of what the pathways to power are. And I just have to remind people that even though there might be more people in New York and California, you live in a federated republic. And if you want to undo that federated republic, you still have to deal with the fact you're in a federated republic, which means you cannot be limited to popular appeal on the two coastal cores of capital. Like that's just not going to work. I've been talking a lot. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Connor. I'm going to probably have you back to talk more about these strategies as they happen, because one thing I think that you and I have been hinting at this entire conversation is this is still an ongoing process. We are still living through this. Like this is not over.
No, by any stretch.
And if this new round of unionization is going to matter, it's going to have to come up against this bulwark of the Southeast. Otherwise, it's kind of dead in the water.
Yes.
This has been the shores on which the labor movement in the United States has washed up on twice in the 20th century. So let's not make it happen a third time in the 21st. Like, it's I mean, in a real sense, the graveyard of the labor movement keeps being the Mason-Dixon line.
Right.
Like it really has been.
And I mean, I just, just to, jump off that point. I mean, in my mind, there is no socialist movement in this country without a labor movement. And there's no labor movement in this country without the South. So answering this question is basically become my life's work. It's on like a little bit on hold at the moment, but you're bringing me back into it, Derek, and I appreciate that. So definitely need to keep the eye on the prize for this, because this is the question to answer: is how do you unionize the South? I think understanding that history, our shared history, culture, and basically, a lot of it's unearthing history that just is there, but just, it's been obscured by of myth making and a lot of other things.
Absolutely. And I think when people look at even the demographics of the country, where you see where there's growth, I'm like, well, you're going to have to win. Like, if nothing else, you got to win Texas. You need to win Georgia, and you need to win a couple of the Western states. Otherwise, you're in states with its population are just declining. Like, maybe not California, but New England.
Right.
Definitely. And that's been like a 1.5 generation long trend. So like, to me, I guess like the one place where I draw hope is that the industrial Midwest is sort of where this intersects. And that is weirdly where the organic workers' radicalism tends to happen. Both at like when BLM starts, as like a black urban movement that's also tied to labor, it starts in the industrial Midwest. And those issues do speak to Southerners for good and ill. Like sometimes it scares the shit out of them, but like, it does speak to them in ways that like struggles in California and New York, even when they're about foreign policy stuff that people in the United States are in the South are broadly sympathetic to. It's not going to have the same resonance. You got to tie all that together. Otherwise it goes nowhere. And, that's my big thing with this Gaza protest right now is like, it's good that the Gaza protests are forcing us to reconcile with a lack of foreign policy engagement during the aught teens, like during the Bernie period. Like we kind of talked about foreign stuff, but it was always like minor.
Right.
But my point has always been like that's going to resolve itself one way or the other. You can't build the left in a country off of a foreign policy issue forever, because it will be resolved one way or the other. And that means we somehow have to get labor and international concerns back together in dealing with this. And I do think that might be a way that you get past the Southern stuff, is like you have to work like I said, illegally, because also in the United States, international solidarity striking is kind of illegal. So it's stuff that we need to be able to do. Otherwise, you're going to have like rapid capital flight, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, anyway, thank you so much. Where can people find your work, Connor?
So you can find my Substack, like you said, that's dormant. I've written for Cosmona. I've written for Jacobin, the International Journal of Cuban Studies, few other publications, but I'm working on getting some stuff out. I've actually been working on a piece for a very long time on suburbanization. Like that's one of the key pillars of my of what my intended project was going to be, was on suburbanization. Hopefully I have that within the year. It's been hard to write recently, but that's where you can find me.
All right. Well, that gives me, if we get you back on the show in the future, like in the winter, maybe we'll talk about suburbanization. I also like to talk to you about Cuba, because Cuba is a fascinating case study for me. As like, I always talk about, like, I have trouble defending actually existing socialist countries, but Cuba, with the exception of its AIDS policy in the 80s and some of its anti-homosexual policies in the 60s and 70s, I can mostly defend what Cuba does. And I can kind of defend, about 50% what Vietnam does. And then, like, I guess China is its own special problem. But like, I do feel like those countries are kind of weirdly understudied. I think interest in Cuba has come back, particularly after like there was a relaxation of the sanction regime. Then it was then reimposed, and of course Biden, seemingly being a massive coward on foreign policy after Afghanistan, did not try to renormalize relations with Cuba, which would have been, an objectively progressive thing, and particularly since he's not going to fucking win the Miami vote anyway.
Right.
Like, it's just like, they're not going to vote for you, dude. Like,
yeah, I mean, lifting the sanctions on Cuba would, I mean, from a progressive foreign policy perspective, probably be the most progressive foreign policy in
lifting the sanctions on Cuba and normalizing relations with Iran, even though I do not want, like, I want to say, I'm not a fan of the Islamic Republic. I want people to know that, but like that would be objectively progressive. Like,
well, I think most people, like, they fundamentally misunderstand, like, when you're saying like you want normalization, it's because that's part of what keeps that regime in place in the first place. Right. Is the sanctions regime.
Yeah, exactly. Like, sanctions, I've never seen where sanctions regimes have ever, not just in the case of Russia where people talk about today, but have ever done what they say that they do. It seems like they do the opposite. Like, if they're supposed to weaken regimes, it seems like, no, dude, they've totally strengthened them.
It turns the nation into fortress, right? Like, that's basically, like, you get this siege mentality, right? Like, we're all in this together, and that's part of what's made Cuba last as long as it has, like, if we're being honest. But there's a lot of good things about Cuba. Don't get me wrong. I have, like you, I'm a Cuba defensist, but we have to admit that the embargo has actually had the effect of maintaining the solidarity of the Cuban people in building socialism. So
yeah, Yeah, go ahead.
It's also been terrible at a terrible cost, mind you, too. But
Right.
again,
Yeah. I mean, one of the things, like, Cuba developed one of the best healthcare systems that has no fucking resources. Like, it's actually inspired a lot of ingenious stuff. However, like, I don't know that it can last forever. I mean, this is the thing, like, these sanctions regimes, administrations, like, they do break a lot of the times, like, but not from the sanctions. They break from some other external trigger making the sanctions impossible, and then all the chaos was out from there. Like, you can't maintain a siege economy forever. This is my kind of weird response to, like, Ben Norton recently talked about the people outside of the imperialist system, and he was like listing, like, his lists were like Syria, Cuba, Iran, and Russia, and that's made them like blame socialist something or other. And I'm like, they're not socialist, but also, like, you're missing the fact that they're not in the imperial system because they're not allowed to be, not because they don't want to be. Like, it's a very strange, inversion of causality there. And sometimes that has positive results, like we said, but, like, but it tends to be limited because, well, I tend to think Marx and Engels were right that socialism in one country over a long period of time is not maintainable. Like, it's just not. Like, you can't develop productive forces and whatnot. Like, you flounder out.
And I think, like, the example of actually existing socialism has borne this out. Is any actually existing socialist country that's existed for any amount of time has eventually backslid into capitalism. I mean, like, that's just, to me, that just seems like an obvious thing. But I don't know. I know not all of the left agrees with me on that, but I mean, even Cuba has started, putting in more and more market reforms, and it's just it's had to.
The DPRK has put in market reforms. It's just only aimed at Russia and China, so no one in the West knows about it. Like, it's like, liberalization has been universal to these countries in a way that can't be explained ideologically, except that there's no international socialist movement for them to connect up to. I mean, if I had a critique of China beyond, Dungist excesses in liberalization, it would also be that they have not really tried to reestablish an international at all. The Belt and Road Initiative is still not really an international. It's like a Marshall Plan. So, like, it's which, again, that's not an insult, but like weakening U.S. blue water trade isn't it really important to weakening U.S. imperial capital. I mean, even Bordiga realized that, but, like, it's not the same as an international in any meaningful sense. Anyway, thank you. So just people have a preview of what we'll talk about in the future. Thank you, Conor, and I'd love to have you back on the show in a few months. So take care.
Great talk. Bye.